delighted to join the third panel. My name is Sascha Ostanina. I'm an EU Security and Foreign Policy Fellow at the Berlin-based Jacques Delors Centre think tank. At the third panel, we're going to be talking about the Russian-Ukrainian defense industrial competition and what nuclear blackmailing has to do with it. And I have a stellar panel of guests to talk about those topics. Starting from my left, William Alberque. He's a Director of Strategy, Technology and Arms Control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Next, I have Roderich Kiesewetter. He is a member of the German Parliament. Gustav Gressel, a Senior Research Fellow, Policy Fellow, my apologies, from the European Council of Foreign Relations. And we have one more person online, Mykola Bielieskov, who is a Research Fellow at the National Institute for Strategic Studies in Ukraine. Mykola, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know that you have limited time available for us today, and I want to start with you. And my first question is about the year of 2024, the third year of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. When we look at the discussion in Europe, and in Germany in particular, there is a slight understanding that the 2024 year is a year when we can take a break, breathe in and breathe out, and start preparing our defense industrial base, our arms production facilities, figure out what we're going to do with Macron's sudden proposal to put European or NATO troops on the ground. Can you describe us how this year is seen from Ukraine? Because I'm pretty sure this is absolutely not the picture that Ukrainians themselves are having now at the moment.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for an invitation. Hope you can hear me. I'm delighted to see familiar faces, to see new faces. Greetings from Kiev. Well, from point of view of Ukraine, everything is quite simple. So we are in a second phase of a big war from the standpoint of the race between military-industrial complexes. So the pre-war stock accumulated before 24th of February 2022 is depleted. First, it was depleted by Ukraine, then Russia depleted it, and now West depleted it. So right here, right now, from the point of view of Ukraine, the question is whether NATO countries, EU countries are ready to translate this nominal economic and GDP advantage they possess compared to Russia, translate this nominal advantage into actual advantage. And well, basically, we are told that you need to wait for at least one more year before European military-industrial complex start to produce necessary amount of artillery, and that's how it's seen out of Ukraine to be shot.
Can Ukraine withstand this additional year of fighting with Russia while NATO and the EU are still trying to figure out their production facilities ways?
Well, we don't have a luxury of a choice. We need to persevere. That's a pity. That's a great tragedy as for me that 2 years proved to be not enough. And if Western countries mobilize the same way they mobilize now, they did it in World War II, I guess Axis powers would not have been defeated in 1945. And that's the problem. But again, we gained 2 years, and now we are told that we need to endure for one more year, and we don't have like a choice. That's why, for sure, we persevere. We're going to find some ingenuity solutions. As you see, asymmetric approaches, asymmetric strikes targeting Russian oil and gas infrastructure, and we have no choice basically. And we hope that really next year the minimum requirement of shells for Ukraine would be finally met, and we can credibly fight Russia in terms of supply of ammunition, artillery shells first and foremost.
Thank you, Mykola. Gustav, my next question goes to you. What went wrong? Why those 2 years were not enough, and why Ukraine needs to wait for one more year? How those processes within those 3 years were developed that Ukraine still requires time?
Well, the main problem was that most Western governments, not only Europeans, but Washington is to blame to quite a large extent as well, thought that the war would not last very long.
Is it the same as the Russian idea of the 3 days?
Yeah, it was not 3 days, but sort of in 2022, of course, at the beginning of 2022, people thought that Ukraine would not last long, not 3 days, but 3 months, and then the war would transition into guerrilla warfare. Once they came to the idea, and that was basically April 2022, that was not the case, and they started to think, okay, on existing footage, when will the Russians have exhausted their potential? And then they thought the war would probably end. But Russia mobilized the defense industry, partial mobilization, and they carried on. 2023, I heard a lot of voices that, yeah, after the counteroffensive, the Russians will seek negotiations, and then the war will be frozen, and it's going to be end. This is going to be the end. Well, it's not. And the problem is all these kind of illusions on a quick end, they deferred the starting point of saying, okay, now we have to produce like mad. There was a lot of decisions, like when I started to discuss this in defense industrial support, refurbishment of second-hand stockpile, etc. And for example, in 2022, asked people about, look, these martyrs, they are all these Leopard 2 in this storage site, in this storage cell, they're old, but you know, we can renovate them and train and bring them. It lasts 1 year, they're so old, it will last 1 year. In 1 year the war will be over. Well, in 2023 the war wasn't over. The problem is all these measures for second-hand equipment, to renovate them, it lasts, depending on how, in what state the vehicle is, from like 4 months to 1 year. If you only take the ones that take 4 months, that's roughly what was being donated to Ukraine. But the 1 year vehicles, a lot of countries just shy away from it because it takes too long. The same with the ammunition. A newly produced shot takes 6 to 9 months to materialize. Even for such a stupid, quote unquote, product like artillery ammunition, not because it's so complicated, but the propellant charge, the powder, it needs a time to stabilize. So again, 9 months. If defense industry said, yeah, you can order, but you'll get your shot in 9 months, a lot of governments said, that's too long. Then, of course, there was a lot of politics. The EU Commission actually started to float the idea of this 1 million round initiative in November 2022. And first they were told, no, that's none of your business. Then it was, okay, you can do that, but it's still the prerogative of the national states that should do that. And you can just make some framework contracts and laws, but we'll do that. Then I sort of found a compromise. They found the subsidies for the defense industries to actually be able to increase their production to do that. And then they made the contracts, and then the nation states said, yeah, but we're not going to sign that because your contracts are wrong and we want to negotiate better contracts. And so they started again negotiating, and the contingencies for the artillery ammunition that should have been booked by September were not booked by a lot of member states. I thought, in next year the Americans will cover this. They were told by Washington that, don't worry, we'll cover this. Then came the tussle in Congress, and suddenly they said, oops. And now, of course, they're running behind time. And the problem is, artillery ammunition, we are running behind time, but actually we do as well with tanks, with infantry fighting vehicles. On artillery, at least the French have their initiative, and there is the Danish Nordic initiative to buy checkmate howitzers. There's a little bit of production going on, but for a lot of other fighting vehicles, we're basically waiting for Ukraine to produce this stuff on their own, but there is no plan B. If the Russians manage to hit these factories, there's nothing from the West that's coming forward, because we were told a new tank, 3 years, the war won't last 3 years. Now we're in the third year. Infantry fighting vehicles, usually 2 years from order to delivery. We were told the war won't last so long. The war is over 2 years old. The full-scale invasion, the war is 10 years old. But yeah, that's and it's this mindset that prevents people from scaling up defense industry. At least in France, it's changing. In Poland, in Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic, it changed quite quickly. But in other countries, in the Nordic countries, it changed. But in other countries, change is gradual, slow, partial, uncomprehensive. Yeah, and that's the issue.
So if we look at like March 2024, can we say that there are at least a couple of countries that are running in full speed and that will be able to help Ukraine starting from January 2025? Or is it going to be another year of political promises?
Well, it depends on what kind of ammunition and what kind of defense goods we're talking about. So yes, the artillery ammunition in 2025 will be less of an issue because now we ramp up production. We will next year be at least able to sustain Ukraine on the defensive minimum, and together with the Americans, if they then are on board, depending on their presidential election, it might actually lead to a situation where we can deliver stuff to Ukraine to enable them to have at least localized fire superiority. So this is getting better. Problematic, for example, is air defense. Here, actually, the Germans are not so too bad. They ramped up production, for example, for IRIS-T. The problem is IRIS-T alone is still too few. And the critical bottleneck with Russia buying North Korean and Iranian ballistic missiles are Patriots. Because unfortunately also in France, SAMPT interceptor, so the Astra 30, which has roughly the same capabilities as Patriot, is produced in much too slow numbers. There is no big batch order for this missile up today, although the launches were delivered at the beginning of last year, but there's no ramping up of ammunition production, and it's as this missile has a much narrower usual customer base, let me say so. It's also for them industry-wise harder to, unless there are big orders from the few countries that operate the missiles, to really ramp up production, because if for such an expensive weapons platform, you really need to have a 10-year procurement plan in order to justify an increase in production. And that hasn't come, neither from the Italians, nor from the French, nor from the British, which are the three main operators of this thing. Yeah, so Patriots will be the bottleneck. And here the Americans are indispensable. They produce it. German Patriots will roll off the assembly line in 2030. Contracts were conducted last November that finalized it, but it takes time. Japan also produces Patriots, but of course they have very restrictive export laws. Now the Americans are the central buffer. They buy Japanese Patriots to free up American Patriots to go to Ukraine. But if the central buffer that really sort of allows all these swap deals would cease to exist under President Trump, then we're in big trouble. And that could make a lot of things. And again, for tanks, for infantry fighting vehicles, we are only resting on Ukraine's own production because there's basically nothing else. If the Patriot plan falls apart, then the other things fall apart as well, because the Russians will more freely attack these sites that produce them. So this can have tragic follow-on consequences, and that's what I'm really worried about.
Mr. Kiesewetter, can we blame everything on these political competitions inside Germany, inside the EU, between the European Commission and individual member states, in the US, between the two parties? Is those political difficulties in reaching a joint solution or a common solution in one country, is it the main explanation why Western aid to Ukraine been so, had so many shortcomings?
It's not only a political question, but very brief greetings to Mykola, and thank you for your recent visit to Berlin. I believe it's a question of mindset, as Gustav said. It's a question of strategic culture and a lack of political willingness to coordinate European efforts amongst EU member states, amongst NATO member states, and the reaction from the European Union member states was, at least in Sweden and Finland, to become a member of NATO. So we only have left Ireland and Austria being no members, as EU members, no members of NATO. And the strategic culture was deterrence. And Sweden and Finland and the Baltic states have very well understood. And I believe that we see today, we are faced with a split in the European attitude. What do I mean with that? Look to Macron, his speech yesterday, and Medvedev's answer, if you so wish. So Medvedev is clear saying the negotiation position is Ukraine to become part of Russia, dismantling itself. And Macron is saying no red lines. And to be very clear, Macron has now understood that the new Europe will be more Eastern, more Northern, more deterrent, more defensive, more innovative, and less influenced by Paris and Berlin. And Macron now sees, if Trump is elected, there is a lack of European leadership because Germany is not fulfilling its hinge function regarding Eastern concerns and Southern concerns, which are very different in Europe. So Macron sees the lack and sees also the hunger for leadership and coordination. So it is very helpful. Today there is the meeting of Poland, of France and Germany in Berlin, the Weimarian Triangle. I believe it's a dual meeting of Poland and France, trying to convince Germany not to pursue the way of a stalemate, of a frozen conflict. But this is the big difference between Germany and others. The question is, what is the war, the end of the war? And Germany, at least the Chancellor is saying, Ukraine must not lose and Russia must not win. And if you ask the Chancellor, why don't you say to regain its borders of 91, as it is laid down in the security agreement between Germany and Ukraine? He's saying, you have listened to me correctly. So he is not believing in Ukraine regaining its borders. And it's a question of strategic culture and the consequences of Russian deterrence. It's self-deterrence. It's the hope of the old German romanticism that Russia and Germany, Germany's engineers' art and Russian resources might be a second pillar between China and the United States. And this is the old German view. The countries in between are not seen on the same level. And this is the consequence as of today, as we experienced it yesterday in our parliament. And therefore, as a convinced member of the German parliament, I see we have, due to our parliamentary law, too little influence on the Chancellor, who is not only formulating, he is setting the political guidelines into practice. And therefore, we need also international colleagues exerting pressure on Germany to understand that the largest economy in Europe has to start much earlier with production, with standardization, with interoperability. And the key mistake is that we in Germany, you mentioned it, believe that the war will last some weeks and then there is Minsk III. And now they believe, listening to the German population, that in the course of the next year, when we have federal elections, the Chancellor might go public and say, I have prevented Ukraine from a nuclear assault, and Ukraine must be grateful to that, so they could give in and say, okay, we give up some territory. And we do not understand in Germany that this is combined with war crimes, with atrocities, with mass migration, with a loss of perspectives. And therefore, the evil is not only the orientation of Germany towards only the United States instead of coordinating Europe, the evil is a lack of mindset and strategic culture inside this country.
William, since the word nuclear has been brought up, my next question must come to you. So did Scholz succeed in preventing a nuclear assault on Ukraine?
No, I don't think he did at all. I think the reason that Vladimir Putin has not employed nuclear weapons in Ukraine is a combination of a lack of military utility. What target would he hit? Number two, the political costs of introducing nuclear weapons into the conflict.
This would be, a further horrific violation of Russia's international obligations. And as you heard, there was a point in the crisis when even President Xi of China and Modi of India said they didn't want to see nuclear weapons introduced into this conflict. Now, of course, there was no Western threat of introduction of weapons. There was no Ukrainian threat of, so that was a message to Putin himself. I don't think he expected that. I think that actually forced him to moderate his rhetoric and to leave it to his, attack dog Medvedev and the television pundits to say irresponsible things. Since then, Putin has said things that are more consistent with our understanding of Russia's nuclear deterrence policy and its doctrine. So I think the idea that Scholz somehow did something, all he's done is emboldened Russia to attack further by deterring by saying sending propelled artillery would be an escalation, saying battle tanks would be an escalation, sending aircraft. By doing that, Putin realizes that nuclear coercion and nuclear intimidation has worked on Scholz. For Scholz to try to reverse that and say he's prevented a nuclear attack that takes some special kind of mindset to believe that because the bully hasn't beaten someone else up that you intervened. It's disappointing. But I do think that Putin is still inhibited from using nuclear weapons, not only because of the political cost that China and India threatened, but also because the US, the UK, and France would undoubtedly unleash at least conventional weapons on Russia if it were to introduce nuclear weapons into this conflict. We have strong evidence that the US has privately conveyed this directly to, from Blinken to Patrushev, and not just at that level, that the price for Russia would be immense. And you can imagine, the United States firing hundreds, if not more than 1,000 JASMs into just Russian-held Ukrainian territory would leave Russian forces in Ukraine open to massive attack from Ukrainian forces. And also, it's Putin's worst nightmare that the West would get directly involved in this crisis. And if we retaliated at the conventional level, leave it to Russia then to further escalate, this further isolates them, presents Putin with very bad options. And again, you notice Scholz doesn't play a role in any of that.
But to this idea that Russia wouldn't violate this international obligation of not firing, of not using nuclear weapons, nothing has stopped Russia before from violating international obligations. What's the difference this time? Because
I think countries like China and India would actually make it pay a price. So far, you're absolutely correct. I mean, few, if any, countries around the world, especially in the global south, have made Russia pay a price for illegally seizing Crimea. For instance, on several continents, that's seen as a sign of strength. Even Russia in this war not achieving its aims, there are countries that see Russia as being strong. I do think the introduction of nuclear weapons to this conflict would be a bridge too far for many countries who would then be willing to do something, who are currently sitting on the fence. And I think Putin knows it's just not a risk worth taking right now. He is trying to build a coalition in Africa and in the Middle East. He's trying to build this coalition of the sanctioned, the people who will flock to Russia rather than to the United States and the rule-based order. So I think it's not because he loves rules, it's because he has more to lose if he crosses that particular boundary.
And I want to remind our viewers that you have a possibility to ask questions, and I want to address one of them right now. Mykola, if you can still hear me, there's a question about the manufacturing of ammunition in Ukraine and whether Ukraine can produce sufficient amount of those ammunition to decrease its dependency on Western supplies. Can you describe what's happening at the moment with the Ukrainian ammunition production and whether Ukraine can say goodbye to all of those political difficulties in Europe and the US and arm itself?
Well, I'd like to have a situation when Ukraine has this kind of autonomy. Unfortunately, no country in NATO except US is capable of confronting Russia alone. So it's an issue of continuous cooperation. For sure, we can find some niches, some directions where we can be more self-sufficient, like UAV production. Right here, right now, for the last 2 months, January, February, our military-industrial complex was able to produce more than 200,000 FPV drones. But self-sufficiency, it's an illusion for a number of reasons. First, we doesn't possess all technologies, all expertise, and second, it's about being able to finance everything. Because with decreased GDP and all the losses, we can't on ourselves finance everything. That's why the most viable option is to have bilateral agreements between Ukraine and different countries implemented in the field of military-industrial cooperation. Entities, Western military entities, they are bringing technologies, they are bringing production, Ukraine bring labor, and then we combine it and partially it's financed by Western governments, and that's how we meet Ukrainian requirements, because that's an illusion that Ukraine on its own can meet all the requirements, but we are doing a great job, especially in field of different kind of UAVs.
Ukraine just recently signed a number of security agreements with G7 countries. Can those security agreements work as a base for expanding on them and then turning them into the defense industrial agreements between Ukraine and its Western partners?
As far as I understand, after conclusion of these agreements, there was already a huge interest out of specific countries. They want to understand how our military-industrial complex writ large is functioning. That's why, as for me, it's a good sign that specific countries and their enterprises mean business. That's why, yeah, that's one of the fields I'd like to see radical changes, because in 1992-2021, Ukrainian military-industrial complex existed as an autarky, as a part of USSR military-industrial complex with no connections or very loose connections with Western military-industrial complex. So I'd like for Ukraine to take a model of Poland. So Poland quite successfully integrated with Western entities in terms of military-industrial cooperation, and that's the future for us. Otherwise, we should be open that Western governments won't be ready to finance purely Ukrainian enterprises. So they have their own interests. They want some part of the profit retained in their countries, and that's natural. So we need to find models that is most suitable, and bringing enterprises, bringing know-how into Ukraine, and that's the most viable option. And that's one of the pillars of the security model for Ukraine: more military-industrial cooperation with Western countries, Western entities.
Thank you very much, Mykola. Thank you for joining us today. I know that you have to run, so I'm going to let you free.
I'm really sorry. And thank you for organizing. And again, we are glad that despite all the difficulties we are facing, there are a lot of people who support Ukraine and mean European Resilience Initiative and all people you have in parallel. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your kind words. Mr. Kiesewetter, we heard now that Ukraine cannot be self-sufficient in arming itself. So there is a dependency on the West, there's a dependency on the EU, and in particular, Germany. And I'm going to introduce the T word, Taurus. Yet another discussion in the parliament, yet another no. Can you describe how these discussions are going for people who did not witness them? Those three sets of arguments, the three sets of discussion, did they differ in any way?
Excellent question, thank you. We started the discussion on this in late April last year. I brought it in, and then in the coalition, the Greens and the Liberals demanded it from the Chancellery. And for several months, the Chancellery didn't answer. They were very reluctant, and they gave very different answers. We need them for ourselves. They are not available. We don't have the capability to refurbish them. And about 600 pieces, and 150 of them were available in April. Now a much larger number is available. The challenge was that the Chancellor never gave a clear explanation. So we brought in November a request in the Parliament, and the coalition denied to handle it. So it was then transported to the Committee of Foreign Affairs. And in the Committee of Foreign Affairs, the Chancellor's party demanded always to bring it out of the agenda. And therefore the others, in their loyalty to the coalition, voted with them. So we were in a minority. And then if this has been achieved 10 times, then it has to go back to the normal panel. And we brought it back to the plenary session 2 weeks ago. And then the government brought in an own request mentioning far-reaching weapons, the EU perspectives and the NATO perspective. And the coalition believed that these far-reaching weapons would encompass Taurus. And 3 days after this debate, the Chancellor said no. So they were disappointed. But due to the discipline inside the coalition, they explained that they would support our request to send Taurus, but the coalition would fail and would break into pieces if they voted with our opposition request. And therefore, there is a majority in the Parliament, but there is also the discipline not to endanger the government. And the Chancellor now said that he does not trust Ukraine to use this weapon in an agreement, in a treaty, in a bipartisan arrangement like France and UK and United States did with ATACMS, with cluster ammunition, with Scalp and Storm Shadow. The challenge is that Germany could do that. We could have geofencing and anything. But the key issue of the Chancellor is he does not trust Ukraine because he wants a final German military control on it. This is not necessary. Normally the enterprise which is producing that would install everything. We know that the Ukrainian soldiers and engineers are so smart that they could include this weapon system within a few days and train within a few weeks. So there is no political will on the side of the Chancellor, and his key argument is no trust. And why? No trust means this weapon has a reach of 500 kilometers, so you could reach Moscow. But with geofencing, you could avoid this. And all other countries who are supporting with very deliberate ammunition and deliberate weapons say you can only use it on the occupied territories, but not on the Russian soil. This is a smart idea because then Ukraine could use its own weapons and drones to carry the war on the Russian soil, which is really necessary, to also show the Russian people that they are in a war and to destroy lines of communication, supply chains, and military installations, due to the international law, by the way. And also to employ Taurus in Russia would be according to the international law. But the Chancellor believes, by the Russian deterrence, that then Germany would be threatened nuclear or Kiev would be threatened nuclear. So this is the self-deterrence, and this is the consequence of always talking about red lines, and Putin has abused this, has utilized it, better to say, so that the Chancellor is now in an impasse where he cannot come out face-saving. And so he is like a small child, we call it Trotz. I don't know the right expectations. If you have 2 years old, 3 years old child, it cannot deviate from its course because it would lose its face. And this is now the key question of this coalition, and probably Taurus will not be delivered. And even the Brits have made an excellent proposal to take over the Taurus and then to send their Storm Shadows, and also to send Taurus to UK, and then UK could send it, is denied by the Chancellor. So we see now, also combined with the statement of his caucus leader, the Chancellor is working on the SPD on a frozen conflict. And a frozen conflict, look to Minsk I and Minsk II, means a Minsk III, and this is disappointment, and this is mistrust, and this would lead to a Russia which could refurbish itself and then restart the war and fulfill all its war goals. This is the reason. And so we are in the parliament really in a very bad situation. There is a majority, but due to the discipline of the coalition, there was no majority. And I would like to encourage the Ukrainian people to really, and also our neighbor states, to increase the pressure, not on the government, on the Chancellor. The Greens and the Liberals, and also my caucus, Christian Democratic Party, is really in very high favor to send this weapon to cut off the Russian supply chains to Crimea, because 80% of the attacks on Ukraine are conducted via Crimea.
But you basically just stole my question, because if we cannot convince the Chancellor, and it's one person, is it possible to convince people around him? We all see those videos of Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, and her body language when she heard arguments against the deliveries of Taurus to Ukraine. What would it take to convince other coalition partners to stand up against the Chancellor?
This would damage the coalition, and we would have pre-election, and Putin would clap his hands. The main issue is that the United States start with this pressure. So we have to overcome Kirby, Sullivan, and others, as they did the Americans in the tank question, where Austin and Blinken convinced Biden, and they overruled Sullivan in December and January 22-23. I'm
going to talk briefly about the political aspect of the question and then go back to the Taurus technicalities, Gustav, if you allow me. William, what will it take to convince the US to overcome Sullivan yet again?
Oh, I mean, that's a great question. And if you have answers, please send them to me on a postcard, and I'll employ them right away. Yeah, this timidity within the U.S. system as well has been an issue all along, and I really think it is folks like Austin who are able to make this case the most strongly to Biden. I think Biden's instincts are exactly in the right place. And quite frankly, I think there's just so much going on right now, it's hard to get through to Washington that this is a critical pathway. The U.S. has its own issues, especially in terms of Congress and getting funding through for further tranches of support to Ukraine. I think that's dominating the conversation so much. So I do think it's his colleagues in ministries of defense. If other ministers of defense reach out to Austin and reach out to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and reach out to Commander EUCOM, who's also SACEUR, and tell them to call Biden, I think this will bypass any resistance.
It sounds like a great algorithm. Why wasn't it done?
I think people have a tough time understanding exactly where the levers of power within the U.S. system are. I think Biden has a massive trust for his military colleagues throughout the government. And again, it's because everyone is so watching this battle that's happening in Congress. Everyone's so worried about the election. Everybody's so focused on these 20-meter targets and 30-meter targets, they forget that this is the target that's right in the room. And again, direct contact with the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Commander of U.S. European Command / SACEUR can break this free. We have defense ministerials at NATO, which are fantastic opportunities to concentrate these messages and to get them back to Washington. We have the NATO summit coming up. This is another great opportunity to put this squarely on Biden's radar, because the summit's going to happen before the elections. There's a lot that can happen, and if the U.S. can break Taurus free, I think that would be such a huge contribution to the defense of Ukraine. It's a target, but again, it's not something that everyone's focused on. So perhaps an event like this can remind people that this is a way to go, and to give hope to our European and NATO colleagues who want to see Taurus, that they do have an avenue of pressure to use that has been underutilized so far.
As promised, nerdy technical questions on Taurus in particular. I had a discussion recently with people unrelated to security, and there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding how Taurus works and how this geotagging works, and whether people can just go on Google Maps, look up coordinates of Moscow, and then shoot a Taurus right on the Kremlin. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's a cruise missile. The thing is, in theory, yes, you can Google the coordinates of the Kremlin and enter to the missile, and it will fly there. But it's not going to fly there very well, because there are three guidance systems within the Taurus. The first is GPS. Then there's an internal navigation system, and then there is a georeference system. So that's basically an artificial intelligence pilot. So it has an infrared camera, and the infrared camera looks through the nose of the missile, and the camera sees the terrain, and it has a map of the terrain in its memory, and it compares that. And like a pilot who's flying his glider or sports plane and saying, yeah, okay, here's this church and that's that village, and here and behind there is my aircraft. Basically, the missile flies around and, okay, here's this, here's that, and there's my target. And depending on how sophisticated you want the attack to happen, how deep the missile shall fly. Should it do retargeting? Should it be able to avoid air defense, etc.? This endeavor becomes more and more complex. How small is the target? How mobile is the target? Or what's the time difference the target relocates? That all plays into the amount of how much computing you need to do that, because it's sort of on the highest level of sophistication of an attack. It's very complex to program it. For very simple attacks, it's easier done. So the thing is, when you sort of deliver Taurus to Ukraine, and the same applies to Storm Shadow. Storm Shadow is a bit simpler because only the terminal guidance, so when the missiles really strikes on the target, that is done with an artificial intelligence pilot. And Taurus navigates it all the way, but the principle is the same. And if you see, for example, the Storm Shadow Scalp attacks, the first attacks Ukrainian did some were very stationary easy to recognize targets, because that was sort of the easiest thing to program, and they needed to get used on how to program the attack runs, etc. And they did extensive preparations for that with other reconnaissance, special forces mission, drone attacks, diversionary attacks, to kind of make this few cruise missiles succeed. Ukrainian missile attacks with the French-British cruise missiles became more and more sophisticated the longer these operators were familiar with the programming of the attack runs. And finally, they hit a ship in harbor, which it's a moving target. You need to be good and really promise your attack run will happen in that and that time reference, because the ship will unload for a few hours and you need to strike it there. Otherwise, the missile, because it's artificial intelligence, but it's still 2000s technology of artificial intelligence. The missile kind of sees oh, there's the harbor, but where is my ship? And sort of gets confused, because that's then a too complex situation, etc. So yes, of course, it's complex. Yes, of course, you need to train Ukrainian pilots. Yes, of course, you need to feed them with satellite imagery. Actually, Ukraine already gets German satellite imagery. It's just the resolution would only allow strikes on stationary and non-complex targets like Crimean Bridge, because it's easy to identify. Even if you get a low-resolution picture from the Crimean Bridge, the missile can tell that's a bridge. If you hunt a certain specific weapon system that is hiding behind camouflage, like a command post of a missile battery, etc., then it would get more tricky, because you need to get the dumb computer to recognize that's the command post. There we are. And that would need more experience in coding and understanding and how the code thinks, how the computer thinks, etc. That will come by time. So there's no this kind of technical wonderland that can't be done. It's all a matter of how much money do you want to take into your hand to facilitate that, because depending on which model of also computer calculation center Ukrainians get, how long do you want to produce that, how long do you want to train them, etc. You can have different models, one where they can relatively quickly strike simple targets and sort of later on get more sophisticated, or you train them to the highest sophistication, but they can only use the missile then next year or somewhere. But that's all, in theory, politics to decide on how do you want to proceed. And frankly, I would have had even sympathy for Scholz if he said, well, the process for Taurus is all too complicated. We'll lease that to the British so that they can, because there's no time pressure. I mean, the British are not at war. They can do their conventional deterrence work in the northern part of NATO with the Taurus and give them the Storm Shadows, because they're trained, they know the operation system, they hit, and it's roughly the same missile. I mean, it's not the same, it's a similar missile. The Taurus is wider and it's a bit heavier, so it has more countermeasures and a bit longer range and a bit heavier payload, but that's on the margins, yeah. I mean, here in Germany, we discuss it as die Wunderwaffe. Like, if this, if you give that to Ukrainians, then the war will end and they will march into Moscow. That's nonsense. It's a cruise missile. It's a fairly similar cruise missiles to what the British and French have. And yes, improvements are there on the margins. The only real difference between the two is the British and the French already work on the successor. It's going to be flight tested in a couple of years. It's going to be introduced before the 2030s. Hence, also for the British and the French, it's easier to give that away, what they have, because they know replacement will come soon. That's a trickier discussion for the Germans, but then still, whether deliver it or not, I don't understand why this is not mass-produced 24/7 in Germany already, because we see how important deep strike is in the war. We see how important cruise missiles are as a conventional deterrent. We see how scary the Russians are. We should produce a ton of that anyway, whether we'll give it to Ukraine or not. And it's not done, which also speaks to the lacking Zeitenwende mindset.
But yet another argument from Scholz is that Ukraine will need German boots on the ground.
That's nonsense. And this was debunked. I mean, here comes domestic politics into play. Scholz wanted to be the guy who saved Germany from becoming a party of war. And he thought that, or some of his advisors who understands nothing of the military and even less from technological issues, tell him, look, here it's going to be your word against the defense experts, whom we call now the TV marshals. Yeah? And you can say, yeah, this will need German boots, and everybody who contradicts you, you can say, well, I'm the Chancellor, I have access to classified information, so I know, and I can the Bundeswehr. The Bundeswehr is ordered not to say anything about it. And then you have this narrative, and you can point at the leader of your party and say, yeah, you're a risk taker, warmonger, this is dangerous, and hoping to regain voices from the AfD or Sarah Wagenknecht, etc. Well, then the Bundeswehr leak came up with Taurus, where the chief of the Luftwaffe with 3 other generals were exactly discussing all these options and how long they would take, and sort of what would be a simple option, what would be a complicated option, what would the training requirements be, which are the private enterprises that, if the Bundeswehr can't help, are able to code this missile, are able to train Ukrainians, are able to provide assistance in all of that, because of course South Koreans didn't ask the Bundeswehr for their missiles. Of course they get industry support for that. It's complete nonsense that this can only be done by the Bundeswehr. And of course, this kind of line of argumentation collapsed overnight, and he was proven a liar. And that's, of course, why the debate on Taurus missiles probably won't stop until general elections, because, I mean, this is just too perfect for anybody who is in the opposition, because the Chancellor has proven himself on record, basically on record, in lying. But this is the kind of the rabbit hole he dug for himself. If he would have declined it on the means that, look, we don't get the replacement too quickly, it's easier to give them the British missiles. If he would have reacted to the numerous offers by Sunak and Cameron for swap deals, he could have moved around that. If it's for his party problematic to deliver the missiles, there would have been smart options to do that. He refused to do that because he thought that this is a domestic policy victory for grabs, and it was a self-goal. But now, I mean, the toss is on, and it's his fault, and yeah, I won't save him from that. So yeah, here we are.
While the German Chancellor is considering or hesitating to send Taurus, the European Resilience Initiative Centre is not, and it's collecting donations to support the Ukrainian army with whatever needs are there, and whatever the non-governmental organizations can do. You can see a QR code for the link with the donations on your screen now, or just go to the description of this live marathon, and you can see the link there as well. I also encourage you to post questions that I can forward to my guests, and one of them came with a little bit of critique that we discuss individual weapons too much while Western countries continue to do business with Russia and do not try to cut business ties with Russia as much as we would prefer it to be. Mr. Kiesewetter, the question to you, is there discussion about further sanctioning Russia, further cutting ties with Russia, or either in Germany or on the European level? And if yes, what are its focuses? What does it focus on?
Well, there are a lot of sanction packages ongoing in the European Union. I believe today we have the 12th or 13th one, stopped to count. However, there are some countries who are only sanctioning war-important goods and not dual-use goods.
Is Germany one of them?
Yes, and Hungary. And the question is, why? And it is really a pity for us, because in the parliament there is a majority to improve the sanctions and to exclude war-important goods. There's also machines for CNC production and so on. But this is not yet done. Also, nitrocellulose, which is a kind of cotton, is also exported from Germany to Russia. Because
just recently complained that we cannot produce ammunition because we
lack
nitrocellulose.
And also the question of ship-to-ship transfer. Those ships have to be stopped in other harbors, and there are several other smaller items. The challenge is that there are also some enterprises specialized on procuring, for example, chips in Turkey or in Armenia or even in China, and they are private enterprises who are purchasing washing machines and exploiting their technical devices, which we then find in Russian missiles, for example. So there is a coalition of of Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. And China is the country which is trying to cooperate, for example, with Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, who have increased their import numbers for washing machines by 15 times in Kazakhstan and by more than 1,000 times in Kyrgyzstan, probably from 5 a year to 5,000 a year. And this could be sanctioned with the enterprises, but they say, well, we sell them to private enterprises and these are intermediators. So we have to look who are the intermediators and have to stop them. There is a special investigation in the German media, so I see that these holes are going to be stopped. But we have to be very honest, it's not only Hungary, it's also Germany in this context. And this is not a question to the parliament, it's also not really to the government, it's the free economy we have and the lack of a self-understanding of these enterprises that they are responsible. In France, there are more state-owned enterprises, so it's easier to control them. We have a very small number of state-owned enterprises, but not in this context, and so it's much more difficult to control it. But therefore, we should be a little bit more decent and a little bit more smarter in this context to stop and to contain this.
Well, is it going after individual companies now, or can we adopt the French model? Can we increase the regulation of the free market, which at the end of the day should be regulated by the government?
Well, it's very simple to be resolved to contain dual-use goods. And washing machines are dual-use goods, and this is part of the 13th package, and Germany was against it. But then we have to talk to Bosch, Siemens, Hausgeräte and others and have to tell them, well, show us where you want to export to and we will give you restrictions or better regulations, but don't sell them to anybody who is requesting them. So this is possible, but this needs more political will and also a kind of self-conscience and a question of own strategic mindset to stop the export. One example is Infineon, where Infineon chips are exported since 2014, and now they are ready to stop it. The other are banks, so to freeze bank accounts like Commerzbank and others who have to do a little bit more and to help Ukraine and not to foster their relationship with Russia.
Well, I guess that's now your turn, because we're talking about international regulations and how it can be implemented and how we can differentiate when we're talking about exclusively defense issues and when we talk about free economy. From your experience, is it possible to introduce such an effective sanction regime that it would not be 100% bulletproof, but at least would prevent such mass-scale sanction evasion schemes?
It's a big challenge, especially in the United States. The idea of export controls as being part of your national security was divorced for a long time. Even at NATO, they used to have an export control committee at NATO. But after the end of the Cold War, so many of the non-military instruments of power were let go from NATO and either given back to the nations themselves or reconcentrated in the European Union. And while I think the EU has done a great job, and I'm very grateful for the sanctions and for everything like that, the idea that NATO itself, which has so many non-EU members, Norway, Turkey, the United States, Canada, I mean, the idea that they outsource a lot of this to the EU, and even within the EU, you have Cyprus and Malta and Hungary and Austria, who may be against these things. It strikes me as a little bit odd. I think NATO needs to claw back some of these non-military instruments of power. Again, in the Cold War, it was not the case that they would outsource these things. And there's no reason why they can't use the European Union and other organizations where NATO members also have membership to increase their reach, to increase their span of control. But I think these things should be decided at NATO headquarters among allies, should then be used in these other organizations. But export control itself, I mean, this is literally arms control. This is literally controlling arms. And unfortunately for too many countries, especially in the West, it's seen as individual national profitability and boosting of commerce, the individual companies themselves lobbying against the government for restrictions. But I think this is a case where it's actually inhibition or a lack of political will or a lack of focus from the West to really say, let's close all of the loopholes humanly possible. We know where they're taking advantage of resellers. We know where these chains are going. But the political will to work with industry to shut down all these avenues is very difficult. We've lost the muscle memory, as we say in the United States. And it's time for a much more muscular export control policy. There was a colleague of mine actually in the Trump administration, Chris Ford, who put this very, very well. He said, we have to work together to make sure our friends can run fast and our enemies run slower. And that means things like export control. That means things like coordinating on trade. That means working with not just allies, but with partners as well. But it's something that we have fallen out of the habit, and we have to rebuild that habit and really shut all these things down and show politicians that the cost of them not doing it is actually higher than the cost of them doing it, and that we're costing lives here. When we open up an Iranian drone and it still has American chips in it, that is a huge failure of America's export control system. And the people in ECFR at the State Department and the Commerce Department need to work together to shut those loopholes down. It's on them that Americans, in the Middle East, that Ukrainians on the battlefield are being struck by these weapons, that our partners and friends in the Middle East are dealing with these kinds of drones all the time with American chips in it. It's an embarrassment. And we all need to work together to close these loopholes and shut down Russia and North Korea and Iran from having access to these things. This coalition that is working together on missiles and on drones, it's just a true embarrassment.
Would the appointment of a new General Secretary of NATO be such an occasion to start introducing tighter export control measures? Or would the person appointed to this position have enough of their plate already to be able to deal with export controls in addition to it, while having an institution with no institutional memory of how controlling those measures?
I mean, let me just say right up front, I think Secretary Jens Stoltenberg has been one of the greatest SecGens in NATO's history. The number of tasks he's taken on, the fact that he's survived and thrived and helped the Allies increase security at a time when I think the wrong person in that job would have not supported Ukraine as much, would not have transformed NATO's defense and deterrence policy as much, would not have maintained support of 30 and now 32 allies. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. Finland and Sweden, Montenegro, North Macedonia. The way Stoltenberg has done things has been truly extraordinary. I know that at SHAPE, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, two of his predecessors, and Steve Covington, who's the advisor to the SecGen, have been working really hard to claw back some of these non-military instruments of power and to reintegrate military and non-military instruments of power at NATO to remind the ambassadors that they have this capability. But there's still within NATO, I think, some allies, and in some ways it's France, in some ways it's Germany, who want to use the EU as sort of a counterbalance to US and UK leadership within European security and want to maintain that sort of independence. And that's usually been the historic bloc within NATO, has been France wanting to preserve the right for it to be the bigger player in the EU. And of course,
is another buzz.
Absolutely, but also the Franco-German engine has normally been what really runs the EU and has necessarily advanced. Now that engine has broken down and Macron is actually leading in terms of trying to support Ukraine, maybe he could be convinced that standing up more powers within NATO is not actually a diminution of France's autonomy or power within Europe, but actually a way to enhance its leadership within NATO and within the EU. Not to take prerogatives away from the EU, but just to remember that if you're a NATO member state and you're not an EU member, that you still have the right to work with NATO allies to wield these non-military instruments of power to deter Russia, to support our allies and partners and friends, to help defend Ukraine.
Can I add two things here? One of the biggest problems in the whole sanctions quagmire is implementation. And the EU is great on working on regulations, but it has no muscle to implement them. and also sort of the special envoy for sanctions, they're looking into implementation. They're looking like, is Austria, is Hungary that needs to translate the EU regulation into domestic export laws, drafting these laws correctly. But nobody's controlling them. Are they actually implementing it? And that's the huge problem, because first of all, some countries don't have the muscle themselves, especially smaller ones. They don't have a really capable foreign intelligence service. They don't have diplomatic or trade attaches that can actually double check or do due diligence. Either companies buy that because they're afraid of external US sanctions, or they just don't. And in these days, they just don't. And the second thing is then you have states like Austria and Hungary that are basically doing the minimum they can. They don't object the legislation because they know that that will have a cost in Brussels. You know, you would pay for that if you are a sanction spoiler, but you just don't implement them. And it's much harder for other countries to basically see, oh, our stuff is going out via Hungary or via Austria, and you know, it's much easier to hide. The next thing is fines, court terms, time, and here I'm looking at Germany, and time. It actually needs to really sort of get managers into jail. The German legal system, the courts are so overworked. Prosecutory service, they're clogged. It's a capacity issue. So a lot of the bad guys, they say, well, we can export. You know, nobody's going to bust us. And if the fines are so negligible, you know, I mean, you can run on high profit selling to Russia, and if you're caught, you know, you're paying a nominal fee. That needs to change as well. There needs to be punishment for misdeeds. There needs to be also a clear consciousness in legislations that these are not kind of cavalier affairs. You know, it's really these people help Russia kill people, and you're basically committed second-degree murder if you export this stuff to Iran or to Russia. That mindset isn't there yet, and this harshness of our penal system isn't there yet. But it needs to come there. Otherwise, you will always find a crook who, for a decent margin, will resell this stuff.
And then if that problems that you has at home, then it's difficult to go out there to Turkey, for instance, and say, hey, Turkey, you need to align with our sanctions, because you cannot align them within your own union.
Second that, and of course businessmen there will even find less risk, because Turkey, I mean, they have 80% of their foreign trade is with the European Union, so it's not that they're completely invulnerable to that. But of course, if they don't feel pressure, if also private enterprises there don't feel pressure, if business representatives don't have to think that, I can't go to Germany for a sales fair or for whatever other business I do because I'm on an arrest warrant, then of course they'll be happy to, you know, cut the margins and do what they're doing.
Mr. Kiesewetter, citing Gustav Gressel, looking at Germany, we had this speech 2 years ago about Zeitenwende, another buzzword in this debate, which happened to be not that large as everyone expected, not that miraculous. It didn't solve all the problems hesitations that Germany had when it comes to understanding its own security powers and understanding its role within the EU. Do you think that Zeitenwende 2.0 might be coming? Do you think that finally, after those 2 years of hopes and drawbacks on the government side, do you think that that's the time when actual changes, when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to funding the Bundeswehr, do you think that's coming? Or do we still need this, again, mindset shift?
I'm full of hope and expectations, but when I listen to the speech of the Chancellor this week and in the Parliament and to his caucus leader, I see that Zeitenwende is already history, because it's only linked with more money for our defense budget. And this means 100 billion euros, which lost about already more than 20 billion euros to inflation and interest rates. Zeitenwende is a question of cultural awareness, of strategic culture as well, and the willingness to see that this Zeitenwende has to take place in the civil society, in the universities, that we need an integrated approach to security, that in Germany we need to redefine security. In Germany, security is defined by social security and welfare, but there is also domestic security and foreign security and economic competitiveness. And these 4 or 5 facets of Zeitenwende, they are not yet completely in the public mind or in the public debate. In the parliament, yes, we reiterate from my party, from the Greens, more or less every week of session, but in the government, Zeitenwende is now only focused on to mitigate the war against Ukraine, to explain to the people that there will be no change in their social welfare, whereas we see, for example, Finland or Lithuania, who explain to their own people that the crisis is so strong and there are multiple crises, polycrises, which are challenging the security system, and that the people have to understand that their security is dependent from a mindset of deterrence and enablers, and that if this is not the case, their own social welfare is endangered. And this is not yet the case in Germany. There are some promises, and we in our liberal conservative party, Christian Democratic Union, Christian Social Union, we are a little bit in fear of the voters, because we have not only the European parliamentary election, we have 3 elections in Saxonia, Saxonia-Anhalt and Thuringia, where very right-wing parties, which are close to Putin, they are their spokespersons, if you so wish, might gain the majority, or at least will become part of a government. So we are too careful. And I believe we can only convince the public if we are steadfast, if we are strong, if we say, no, this is wrong, like Helmut Schmidt was, like Helmut Kohl was, like Adenauer was, very clear. But in Germany, people believe in disarmament and in a kind of romanticism, but Willy Brandt, who is the witness for that, had a defense budget of 4% of the GDP. So he was able to invest in trust-building measures because the other side, so yes, we need to take them serious because they have 3 military corps, they have 12 divisions, 36 brigades and 80 reserve battalions. This is not the case today, so the credibility is not there.
So even the brigade in Central Lithuania by Germany is not convincing you that this shift
is the strongest signal of the current government to our partners, that we are not receivers of security any longer, but we also are willing to promulgate security. This was the best decision the defense minister did, and the best decision in security politics of Germany in the last 20 years. However, it must be financed. And this brigade is part of the division which should be fully fledged next year, but the brigade will be available in 27. So there is a lot to do also from the Lithuanian side, but it is a game changer in our willingness to support our neighbors, because we received 11 countries in Germany until 1989, even from Canada, a brigade was there, but only because we invested credibly in our own defense, and Lithuania does.
William, I think you want to add something on that?
No, you're 100% correct. Deterrence is the primary entering argument for any kind of dialogue that you have to have. Why would your adversary engage with you if you can't defend yourself? And for Germany, not only to be able to defend itself, but I mean, there is a debt here. It's remarkable, living in Germany now for 3 years, how many people forget that West Germany was one of the largest and most capable militaries. And at the end of the World War II, there was a real question as to whether West Germany would rebuild its military. And it only joined the NATO alliance in 1955 and then really rearmed. And once it rearmed, it made sure, as you pointed out, 4% of its GDP. And the allies that were stationed here, the British Army on the Rhine, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Canadians, all here, the French, US, UK, And we have to recall that the US, the UK, and French forces that were in West Berlin, their job wasn't to win. Their job was to die for the cause so that the Soviets would be confronted.
And I would assume that they did not believe in disarmament.
They believed that with deterrence, that again, this gets back to at NATO, the Harmel Report, which is a 1967 report embarked upon at the behest of the Belgian Foreign Minister, Pierre Harmel, to understand the core purposes of the alliance. And the two core purposes was to deter your adversary, to make sure that no ally felt under threat of attack. And on that basis, you could have talks to see if you could resolve whatever the underlying conflict was. But unfortunately for Germany, since the end of the Cold War, it's been, no, let's just jump right to the talks. And again, Russia does not see that as a serious position. And so for me, when I heard Zeitenwende, when I heard that speech, I thought maybe this is the moment where Germany really transforms itself, where it can defend not only its own borders, but then it has an in-theater capability to project that defense all the way forward. And when I found out that when Germany first sent the EFP, the battalion, forward, that it didn't have rules of engagement. It couldn't actually defend Lithuania. It could only defend itself if it was fired upon. It wasn't really capable of being reinforced. So now the promise to send a brigade, great. If that means that Germany is going to have an in-theater expeditionary capability to defend allies credibly and to defend itself, and to look at its partners, its new allies, Sweden and Finland, and be able to look at them square in the eye and say that we're doing all that we can do, when Finland is clearly doing everything that it can do. Sweden is literally transforming its military. You go back 10 years ago and they had no land forces. They had disbanded their land army, only an out-of-area expeditionary force. But they made the decision after Crimea to re-stand up 3 heavy land brigades and to buy more capable cruise missiles to start to defend themselves. And then 2022, they and Finland to join the NATO alliance. These are countries that have transformed their defense relationship and doing exercises where Jutland gets invaded, the exercise Aurora, and realizing they couldn't defend themselves without Allied support, without standing up its own credible military force. I would love to see Germany turn itself into a real provider of security in the region and to be able to stand up military forces commensurate with its wealth. Because, exactly as you said before, the balance of power in the alliance is shifting to the east. And if Germany does not fulfill Zeitenwende, having raised expectations so high, and its military is seen as being less than adequate even after Zeitenwende, then its political power within the alliance will fall further. And Sweden, Finland, Poland, and the Baltics, they're more than happy to lead. But if Germany, for instance, transforms Rostock into a real logistics, sea logistics center to be able to flow forces through, heavy forces through to the Baltics, if Germany is providing larger and more capable forces, really credibly able to defend, if the Sky Shield initiative really supplies the alliance with integrated air and missile defense to be able to challenge Russia's ability to penetrate our air defenses or to fire missiles, then this will all have seemed like an amazing step forward and Germany fulfilling its destiny within the alliance as a security provider. But if it doesn't, that credibility will wane and other people will pick up the mantle and lead the alliance from now on.
Thank you for your words.
Thank you for your words.
I agree more.
I have a question from our public, just quick, and I encourage people to post questions to the European Resilience Initiative Centre YouTube channel. William, you briefly mentioned the rules of engagement. So what's going to happen if the German base in Lithuania is attacked? Are they going to fight back? Are they going to negotiate? Are they going to propose to go to Minsk?
Well, they have to. I mean, the commitment now. So now NATO has transformed since 2019. Well, you go back even further. Since 2017, the Supreme Allied Commander realized that the alliance wasn't ready to defend itself, and we were operating off a strategic concept that was written in 2010, which already should have acknowledged that Russia was a threat because Georgia had already been invaded, but didn't. Still looked at Russia as a future friend, lover, member, who knows. And so Secure decided to try to change, and through the military processes came up with a new concept for the defense of the alliance, the defense and deterrence of the Euro-Atlantic area, what we call DDA. And it has gone even further now with a single integrated operational concept for the defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. This is the first time, so this was just agreed 2 years ago, this is the first time that NATO has a standing defense plan since 1989. We didn't have a standing defense plan. We had different scenario plans. Sure, the graduated response plans were a good step forward, brought about by Phil Breedlove, but now we have a standing defense plan. So previously we used to generate capabilities based on scenarios, which meant it wasn't really serious. Now we have a standing defense plan. So our capability requirements are much higher and they're real. And now we have to look to allies. And this is an opportunity for Germany, not just to be a framework nation, not just to provide, some kind of concept for defense, but to actually provide forces that are being tasked to actually defend and resupply and ammunition and rules of engagement that are going to be flexible to defend Lithuania, because all of these plans are now predicated not on defense in depth, not based on a tripwire that dies and then hopefully, we are able to reinforce and defend, but to defend the NATO alliance so that every inch at every moment is defendable. This was the pledge at the Madrid summit. This was reinforced at Vilnius. This is an utter transformation. In the Cold War, we had to rely on things like atomic demolition munitions to stop the Soviet army on the line. It's not the case anymore. With the conventional forces we have, with the artillery, with HIMARS, with high precision, with cruise missiles, we should be able to defend every inch of the alliance all the time. And I think with Finland and Sweden in the alliance, and if Germany can really play a role making sure that this Nordic-Baltic region is secure, then Russia will not be able to invade the Baltics. They certainly won't be able to invade Finland. They've never been able to invade Finland. They're not going to be able to invade the Baltics if everyone works together. And Russia doesn't want to hit us where we're strong. They want to hit us where we're weak. So the more Germany can do here, the more they can deter, and the more Russia will start moving its high readiness forces out of the Baltic-Nordic region and move it to regions where they can actually do some damage. So again, Germany can safeguard the future of the alliance by becoming a more credible partner within this region. Are they willing to do it? And anything that we can do to help, this system. It's one of the reasons why IISS Europe was stood up, was to try to transform the defense debate here. And we haven't had the effect that we've wanted to have so far. But I hope we can continue to work with our friends in Parliament to transform the dialogue here and to make sure that Germany is a huge provider of actual, real, credible, deployable, dependable, credible defense and deterrence capabilities within the theater.
Gustav, if I listen to William, it sounds like Germany needs to become basically France, minus its own nuclear weapons. How long will it take? Do you think it's possible?
Well, it has to be possible, and the thing is, we haven't talked about the orange elephant in the room, and the things have to go much faster anyway. But coming back to Mützenich's dreadful speech yesterday, he said we should think about freezing the conflict. Well, Mr. Mützenich, if you want to freeze a war where Ukraine had, in a Minsk format, over 200 rounds of negotiations and more than 20 different ceasefires, and none was kept. If you love Sam Charab for his talk about the Korean solution and blah, 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 well, then you have to talk about German Allied forces on the demarcation line, because that is what freezes the war. If you can then choose whether you want the Kupiansk sector or the Avdiivka sector, or the Bakhmut sector or the Robotino or whatever, but you will have then, and not a brigade, but then you need at least to put a division on the ground there. And is the Bundeswehr ready to provide a division for Mr. Mützenich to freeze the war? And what would it cost? And this is the thing, that there's so many things floating around, nobody ever thinking through the consequences of their words, what they announce, what they imply, even for themselves.
It's interesting how when the discussion goes to delivering Taurus, Germany doesn't want to be a party of war. Yeah. But when it comes to freezing of the conflict, Germany suddenly sees itself as the... It
doesn't see itself, they don't think of it, but the problem is freezing the conflict would need international deployment there. It's just ridiculous to say, Ukraine should freeze that and just live with the promise that nothing ever happens. When, you have a track record what Russia does, and you have a falling attention after the ceasefire, you have a falling international attention because, okay, it's ceasefire, it's over, done, let's go back to our business. What do you expect to happen there? So if you really, as the leader of the leading parliamentary fraction, start to talk about a freezing war, then you should also spell out the consequences for you, for your defense sector, what it needs to imply, how to implement it. Otherwise, it's just nonsense talk for domestic purposes. And that's a huge problem. Defense policy is super serious and super real. And in West Germany in the Cold War, whether you were Social Democrats or Conservatives or whatever you were, you did not use defense matters for nonsense talks and smear your party as sort of the other line of the aisle. That was the serious stuff, and this is the problem with Zeitenwende. We're not yet, and Mützernich was the proof to the case. We are by far not there.
There is also another counter-argument, is that when Emmanuel Macron said that he would consider sending troops to Ukraine, there was a huge opposition from Germany, saying that no, Germany will not send any troops, as if Germany could send any other troops, but the Bundeswehr.
He said NATO will not send any troops. You're not the SecGen here. So you can say Germany will not. This is his prerogative. He's the chancellor. He can say Germany will not send, but he can't say NATO will not send troops because he's not the SecGen. And that particularly infuriated other countries who were also part of NATO and who think a German chancellor should not talk on their behalf.
Mr. Kiesewetter, is the Bundeswehr ready if we wake up tomorrow in a Zeitenwende Germany in which the Chancellor is considering sending troops to Ukraine? Is the Bundeswehr ready to assist Ukraine in an actual, efficient manner?
We are ready to send a frigate within 2 months to the Red Sea. We are able to support with airdrops in Palestine, on the Palestine region, Gaza.
The Red Sea shooting American
and we
drones.
are able to send troops to Lithuania already, a combat-ready troop, very well trained and equipped. The challenge is that we need, well, 3 divisions and to support NATO with at least 10% of any weapons and any equipment of all NATO by 2030. If now troops should be sent, which is a very theoretical question for Germany up to now, perhaps after the trilateral summit today there might be some changes, but it's a very theoretical question. If there is need, there's always be the possibility to send, but the question is how long are they endurable, how long are they equipable, and is the mindset ready that they are knowing what they have to do to defend Europe at its outer borders and to send a signal to Moscow, to Putin. I believe that our armed forces are ready to do this. There is the right mindset, but not the right equipment and the right ammunition so far.
So we're going back to the question of the defense industrial competition.
And of Zeitenwende, and that Zeitenwende is not only a better armed forces, it's also a question of mindset, but also a question of industry. And our industry is not allowed to have a 2, 3, 4 shift system. They have a 39 hours week, and with a 39 hours week you cannot produce the necessary ammunition in time. So there must also be some leeway in our over-regulated country that the armaments industry gets the right guarantees and the right guarantees from the political side, from the Ministry of Finance, and that they have the leeway to produce whatever they want in legal terms in an acceptable time.
So I guess ammunition manufacturers and weapon system manufacturers now to get on a tank and ride to Berlin and demand the changes in,
Look, we have delivered,
in shifts similar to
we have delivered
farmers.
18 tanks, Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, and the production which was ordered after this was only 18. So instead of 200, 300, because they are needed. And the other issue is we have delivered 4 MLRS, 14 howitzers with not the necessary spare parts, with the necessary ammunition. So we give signals, but we do not give the signal to our industry and to our population that we start production, because we need it in the next years, only if for deterrence, but perhaps for more if we are not deterrent enough.
Talking about signals, Gustav, the European Union recently presented its European Defence Industrial Strategy, the first one that was supposed to encompass all stages of the defence production and related things. How do you assess whether this signal is efficient enough and effective enough for the industry to understand that the EU and its member states are now serious about defence?
Well, it was a good signal. It's also sort of to understand the role the EU plays. The EU is a regulator. The EU is a body that takes down kind of market turfs and creates a common market. The EU is an industrial policy actor that can subsidize certain industries that struggle. And it was always outside of the defense sector. All EU policies did not apply to the defense sector. All industrial subsidies, this was always the national prerogative. And now the Commission, with their instruments, are getting into the defense sector, and they have laid out sort of their vision where they want to go. The problem is, of course, it's still not their turf. You have lots of things that are to be decided in national capitals that are national prerogatives only, but the EU cannot do anything on their own. The EU can't procure directly. The EU can only incentivize, subsidize national procurements, even the ammunition incentives. The EU has negotiated en bulk large contracts, but nation states have to sign their contingent of the contract to legally procure something to send it to Ukraine. So it depends on member states playing along. And there's unfortunately a very uneven readiness of member states to play along and to go down that road. I think it's a first step, but a lot of cans need to be kicked down the road as well. So yeah, it's a start.
It's my final round of questions. Mr. Kiesewetter, I will start with you. First, brief comment on the EU defense industrial strategy. Is Germany ready to go along? And also, how would you see Germany's policy changed in the, let's be less ambitious in the next year to demonstrate its actual support for Ukraine?
We have a very strong and very sophisticated armaments industry, despite of all the regulations. We have very smart engineers and technicians, and this is already known. However, we need to keep these people inside the armaments sector, and we should not lose them to other areas or abroad. And this is, I believe, a key political task for the next years. Next year there will be federal elections. So from probably February or March, we will be in the election mood, in the campaign mood. And this will stop clear-cut political decisions. And the time frame is known by Putin. So if we want to have significant and considerable moves in Germany, we have to urge our country by autumn this year. And therefore, I'm not skeptical, but what we need is a population which is not in fear, but is convinced that their freedom is also the freedom of the Ukrainian people. And if the Ukrainian people gain their freedom, I believe that Germany will be a little bit more decent, a little bit more humble, and stronger on the side of those who are under pressure.
Gustav, your comment on the next year?
I also fear for a very nasty election campaign. I can only recommend to the Social Democrats to not go down the road of peace pacifism. If you look on the polls, Social Democratic voters, the core voters that still vote for them, these people demand stronger support for Ukraine, quite consistently. The Social Democracy lost to the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht, they're lost. It's the same with the Conservative Party. If you cross the borderline to vote for the AfD, despite the fact, and we are talking about a different AfD now than the AfD of 2013, where this was an anti-Euro party and you could, fiscal conservatism, kind of, it was an odd choice, but something you could rationalize with. With all the scandals, with all the knowledge of whom the party is with, relates to, conveys, etc. If you made that decision, you lost to the Democratic Centre. And peace pacifism will not bring anybody who basically has sentiments for the GDR and wants an alliance with Russia back to the Social Democrats. He will only scare off the reasonable people that still support the party. The second thing is all Big Ten parties, and this is not a question with the SPD, are there going to be a Big Ten party or are there going to be an issue party for social justice? If you are a Big Ten party, you need defense experts You need also Bundeswehr officers. You can't treat the Michael Roths and Fritz Felgentreus the ways you treated them over the past years. You need to have this competence in your party. They don't have to be the party stars and determine the party line, but they have to be in there. Otherwise, you're not a big tent party. And I think that's really on the line. I hope the SPD party base exerts pressure on the cadres, because I don't think this is a problem with the party base and them not checking what's going on, but a cadre problem of people who have been grown up in the peace movement and have made a political career in the immediate 90s, where everything was smooth and nice and shiny, and we were all at peace, and are just reluctant to change their mindsets and recognize the fact that it's not the time anymore. Yeah, and that will depend a lot. That will not only depend whether we will have a nasty or not so nasty election campaign, it will also determine the kind of future of the center-left Democratic Party, whether we still have one or whether this stuff is atomized. And yeah, even if you're not a social democrat, Germany needs a center-left party. A country without a healthy center-left party has usually problems. Look at France, where Mélenchon is the only left-wing person. It's a disaster for France and the French parliamentary system to only have this alternative.
William, you have a luxury of choice to comment either on Germany or on the US.
Well, I think I have to comment on the
US. I mean, it is remarkable that I know that if President Biden wins a second term, that support for Ukraine will increase, and that if the Democrats can also take the House and hold the Senate, then support for Ukraine will be locked in. The idea for me as an American that a Republican candidate, if he wins, this is the party of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, would abandon Ukraine, would abandon NATO, would abandon South Korea and Japan, is truly astonishing. I think Donald Trump himself is relatively sensitive to his own party's sentiment. And so I think if Republicans stand up and say, no, we are against Russia, we are against totalitarianism, we're against China, we're against North Korea, we need our allies, going it alone is not a viable path for the United States, that the more friends and allies we have around the world, it doesn't make us weaker, it makes us stronger. If the Republicans stand up and say that, then I'll be much more sanguine about this election. But now, I mean, if you are a national security involved person in the United States, it looks like you have to support Biden. And that to me is just horrifying, that the Republican Party appears to have given up on the rest of the world and true American security. It's a nightmare. So I hope the Republican Party can stand up, and that when faced with the electoral choice, it really does come down to who you want to support rather than whether you want to support Ukraine or not. And I hope, regardless of what party affiliation Americans have, that they will stand up for Ukraine regardless.
That's amazing words, and I hope that some people will get encouraged. If you want to support Ukraine, you can also go into the description of this live stream and see the link to help fund the needs of the Ukrainian army. I want to once again introduce the stellar panel of my guest, Wilhelm Alberque, the Director of Strategy, Technology and Arms Control at IISS, Roderich Kiesewetter, the member of the German Parliament, and Gustav Gressel, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Sascha Ostanina. I'm an EU Security and Foreign Policy Fellow at the Jacques Delors Centre. Stay tuned. Our next panel will be in 15 minutes.